Part 4. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 31. The flying mantis first looked at the dinner, then looked up at Xiu, as if he had made some decision at that moment. It said he was going to stay and he wouldn't be lazy again. Casey floated over from the side. Xiu did not appear happy when he heard this. Instead, he whispered more seriously, "This world is very chaotic and cannot allow us to relax. If we want to go forward, we must unite and work harder than others." As he spoke, Xiu raised his hands towards the two of them. The flying mantis stretched out the broken scythe, and Casey glanced at Xiu lightly, and then slowly stretched out his three-fingered hand. Xiu looked at them and raised the corners of his mouth slightly, "Let's work hard together." But at this moment, a voice came from the side. "Hey, yeah, little Fuden was a little curious when he saw their strange movements, and he was clinging to Xiu's lap and watching. Xiu picked up the little lucky egg and said with a smile, "With you, we will work together to survive in this world. Is this thing really hard? It's worn down a few rocks on me. Or should I say that the organisms in this world are really amazing?" Xiu played with the slightly rough bone knife in his hand, tapping it casually to make a crisp sound. It was made from the grinding of Radha's front teeth. It looked like bone, but it felt heavy in the hand, and its hardness was far beyond that of normal bones. At least no bone in his knowledge could be as hard as that. "Here, this is for you." Xiu threw an object towards Casey with his backhand. When it got close to Casey, it was wrapped in blue light and suspended in the air. "This is Lada's other front tooth. It has been modified into a triangular object that looks like an arrow magnified several times. The head is sharp and the sides are also sharpened. I can't imagine the consequences of being inserted by this thing." And this Xiu took out a yellow cone-shaped spike. This was the tail stinger of the giant sting wasp. Because it was relatively well preserved, Xiu kept it. "It's a pity that the poison gland was destroyed." Xiu looked at the spikes on his hand with some regret. If the poison glands were still there, he could still make use of them and try to prepare an antidote. But these were the biggest gains from that time. The two street guys had no money at all, and their combined total was only a few hundred yuan, which was not even enough for lost work pay. Studying the knowledge of cultivators, Xiu saw contents that could not be seen in illustrated books before. Some of them were very interesting, and at the same time, some of them were very strange, which most people might not be able to accept. Listening to the whistling wind in his ears, Xiu looked up and saw that Casey was controlling the tooth arrow to circle around him. The speed kept accelerating, drawing shadows in the air. Seeing this, Xiu suddenly remembered something and murmured, "Yes, I should make it into a spindle shape. That way the wind resistance is smaller, there is no such big noise when speeding up, and there is no need to waste so much energy." It's just that he was just talking. Now is not the time to waste time on this. He has more important things to complete. Xiu looked at the flying mantis aside. It was currently shuttling back and forth in the forest. Even though it was moving slowly and looked exhausted, it was still persisting. The weakness caused by the last physical exhaustion gave it a very deep memory, especially recalling the previous similar situations, which further made it understand Xiu's intention of arranging the training before. Xiu looked at the flying mantis for a while. The beating he arranged before finally had some effect. At least its attitude was correct. "Okay, let's take a rest first." Xiu went over and stopped the flying mantis, then came closer. "It's a good thing to train seriously, but you must also understand that the body is the most important. If you train your body badly, the gains will outweigh the losses. Come on, take a walk, and I'll prepare some food for you." After saying that, Xiu picked up his backpack and began to prepare nutrients to replenish its strength and energy. What exactly is a skill? How can it be used? Xiu held the book and muttered to himself, but after a while he put the book down and raised his hand to rub his slightly dry eyes. It's a pity that this failed to smooth away those tight brows. On the contrary, because he was away from books, his mind was full of messy thoughts, which exacerbated his confusion. Ah, why is there no such thing as a skill learning machine? Jiu gave up and collapsed on the bed, opening his eyes and looking at the ceiling. As the training progressed in the past few days, Xiaonan clearly felt that their progress was not as obvious as it was at the beginning. That is to say, the bottleneck of what their bodies can reach has come. If they want to improve, they can only continue to maintain basic training and slowly improve their strength through hard work. The other thing is to wait for their bodies to develop until they can carry more powerful forces. Although he knew very well that this day would come sooner or later, he had a headache when it actually arrived. But Jiu was not content with this. He understood that there was another way to quickly strengthen the elf's strength, and that was skills. It's just that the elf encountered a bottleneck, and so did he. Because he had limited access to information, almost all of the books he had on hand were books about breeders, and he had no knowledge about elf skills. There were no mentors or friends around him to guide him, and his seriousness towards the world was already somewhat weak. The combination of these circumstances made him feel like a headless fly, unable to find his direction. Forget it, after hiding for so long, it's time to go out for a walk, Xiu murmured, then turned over to sleep. 700 for this book. Xiu held up the skill overview in his hand, with a slightly surprised look on his face. Knowledge is the ladder of human progress. Books are the carrier. Why are they more expensive? And this is an introduction to elves? Those professors are not cheap. But it's not that outrageous. Xiu's low-pitched complaints only aroused the clerk's disdain. He pointed at it and asked quite proudly, "Do you know what this represents?" "It's the house number." Xiu was a little confused. "Wrong. This represents the most authoritative elf information channel in the Kanto region." He was a little excited after hearing Xiu's answer, and immediately shouted. "This is the branch of Odo bookstore in Qianhong City. It is the largest bookstore in the Kanto area and the most comprehensive bookstore. Many researchers and doctors have designated our bookstore to publish papers and reports in magazines, so what is there in the academic world? We were the first to know the news." Hearing this, Xiu was a little surprised that a formal-looking bookstore he found had such a background. But does this have anything to do with him buying books? Can't it be cheaper? Second-hand ones will do, too. It's just that Xiu's words seemed to anger the clerk. He didn't bother to introduce the glorious history and said in a weird voice, "If you want cheap books, you can look over there. Anyway, the prices of elf-related materials in our bookstore are at this price." Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 32. Xiu put down the book in his hand, turned around and walked out without saying another word. Such a price was simply not something he could afford, and if he really wanted to buy it, those 1 or 2 books would not be of much use. The original purpose of purchasing books failed, and Xiu was a little confused for a while. However, it was a rare trip, so he still had to purchase some supplies to facilitate his later arrangements. Among them, some ideas about elf food needed to be realized. In addition, he wanted to go to the Elf Center in Light Red City to see and contact the most important force in the elf world. The Elf Center is located in the real center of Light Red City. It occupies such a large position in the center of a big city, which shows its strength. You know, there are elf centers everywhere in this world. As far as he knows, the elf centers in each place are different, and they will have local architectural characteristics, which is very different from the stereotyped elf centers in the game. The elf center in Light Red City is not high, but it occupies an exaggerated area. It is a giant building with 12 floors. The interior and exterior decoration has a bit of Japanese style, with red as the main color. Outside is a small square paved with marble bricks, which is divided into parking areas and sidewalks, and there are some flower beds as decoration. Walking forward, there is another big difference from games or animations. Miss Joy is not the only one managing the Pokemon Center. Instead, there are many staff members. They all wear very distinctive uniforms, and some subtle differences highlight the differences in positions and also divide the status. The first floor is a hall. There is a counter in the middle of the hall facing the main door, and two staff members are sitting inside to receive guests. There are several rows of symmetrical chairs on both sides of the hall, and a row of big-headed computers further in. On the left side of the hall is an area separated by a huge glass wall, with an independent swimming pool, which should be prepared for those Pokemons who stay in the water, because Shiu saw Pokemon such as horned goldfish and sea stars. The right side of the hall is also an independent place. At this time, the door is open, and people come in and out from time to time. Shiu looked at the door for a while. There are 3 standard battle venues inside, and there is also a circle of stepped audience seats. It is estimated that the number of people that can accommodate is about 1,000 people. There were people playing a game right now, and there were a few people sitting in the audience, as well as professional referees. However, Shiu had no interest in this now, so he turned to the computer. The computers in this world were not divided into mainframes and display screens, but were a whole, which looked bulky and dull. Just like an internet cafe, Shiu paid the money and turned on the computer under the guidance of the staff. Even though he had never touched it before, he died in front of a computer in his previous life. As a senior programmer, he only studied it a little and became familiar with the operation method, and then began to enter the network world of this world. First of all, it is called a computer, but in fact, its main function is to make video calls, send emails and other primary functions, which is very different from the computer in Shiu's impression, both in terms of function and appearance. Secondly, the network development in this world and at this time is just in its infancy. Except for some more formal information, there is no sign of the existence of passers-by netizens. But there is also a commonality, that is, the foundation of building a network, the concept of computer logic program. Many of the information above have no sense of defense, and such a network seems to be naked in front of an old hand like him. And it keeps tempting him. Shiu looked up the information he wanted and found that it was indeed available, but there were no e-books, all physical books, and the price was about the same as that of the Daewoo bookstore. Shiu also found the website of the bookstore on the internet, which looked quite simple. A bold idea was brewing in Shiu's mind, but he still needed some time to prepare. After working for a while, Shiu got the information he wanted, checked the internet fee after logging off the machine, and found that he had been charged more than 60 yuan in more than 2 hours. The fee was still quite expensive, at least he couldn't afford it. After all, he only had more than 10 or 20 yuan for food a day. After learning a little about the functions and charges of the Elf Center, Shiu began to resist this place from the bottom of his heart. The reason was simple, he couldn't afford it. Shiu stood at the door, looking at the prosperous scene around him, and vaguely felt a sense of incompatibility. This kind of life was not for him after all. After leaving the Elf Center, he walked towards the next place. Shiu took advantage of this time to visit almost all the large shopping malls and markets in Qianhong City. In addition to buying the necessary materials, he also learned about the basic prices. I have to say that the general things are still normal, but as long as it involves elves, the price will definitely be several times higher. I don't know if it is really so valuable. Blue orange and red apple are used for training to replenish physical strength and repair the body, so they consume a lot of energy. In order to get a better price, he went to several stores before negotiating a better price, but his heart was still bleeding when he paid. It's a pity that this money can't be saved. This involves Casey's training progress and physical growth. He has to squeeze out this part of the money even if he doesn't eat. After going around in circles, a day has almost passed, and Xiu unknowingly came to the shabby little park again last time. The surroundings were still so quiet, only someone would walk by the street from time to time, and most of them were in a hurry, and no one would pay attention to this place. Looking at the scene in front of him, Xiu couldn't help but laugh, and said to himself, "It's nice to come and see an old friend." Walking to the pile of debris again, Xiu leaned down and knocked. "Are you there?" There was a rustling sound under the pile of debris, and soon a small head stretched out from the pipe beside it, looking up with its head tilted. "Hello," Xiu smiled and greeted. The Piku was stunned for a moment, but soon reacted. It should have remembered who Xiu was, and it was no longer shy, but walked out. "Have you finished the rations I left for you last time?" Xiu just wanted to reach out and touch it, but the Piku didn't seem to want Xiu to touch it, but avoided it instead. Then he called Piku Piku with some shrinking. Although Xiu didn't have the ability to read minds, he roughly guessed what Piku meant through previous contact. It was probably afraid that it would lose control and the current would leak out and shock him. Xiu found it a little funny to see it cowering, but he didn't take it too seriously. Instead, he took out an ordinary fruit and handed it to him. "Come and eat it." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 33. But Piku didn't rush to touch Xiu because of what he said, although it looked very hungry. Seeing this, Xiu felt helpless about this stubborn Piku, and put the food on the bench with a bitter smile. "Come over here, so you won't be afraid of electrocuting me." And he sat down on the side, but as soon as he sat down, his fatigue was revealed. He couldn't help but close his eyes, and his spine seemed to lose support and he collapsed on it. After walking for a day, even if he was made of iron, he couldn't stand it, otherwise he wouldn't stop here, but go back to the suburbs. He was really too tired. "Piku." Piku jumped onto the bench and called to Xiu. Xiu moved his head slightly, opened his eyes and glanced at it, and then chuckled. "Don't worry, I'm fine, just a little tired." Seeing its slightly worried look, Xiu subconsciously reached out and touched its ears, wanting to give it some comfort. The feel was the same as before, fluffy and soft, and there was also a slight numb feeling. At this moment, Xiu actually had the illusion of petting a cat. All the pressure accumulated during this period of time dissipated at this moment, and the whole person seemed to be healed. It was just that Xiu was concerned about his own feelings and completely forgot that he was holding Piku instead of a cat. His hand was accidentally heavier, pinching Piku and hurting it. He only heard the little guy's slightly panicked cry, and then the current leaked out of the electrical sac on its cheek uncontrollably, just passing through Xiu's arm. "Ah!" Xiu only had time to wail, and then he felt a current running through his body, and his muscles tightened in an instant, but relaxed again the next second. But to his surprise, when the strong feeling at the beginning subsided, the whole body was warm and a little numb, which was actually quite comfortable to some extent. After being electrocuted, he became more energetic. "Good guy. I discovered a new world." Xiu slightly adapted to the situation of his body, but before he could deal with the idea that popped up in his mind, he looked down at Piku as if he had noticed something. As expected, I found that the little guy fell into that kind of self-blame again. "Okay, I'm fine, you didn't mean it, I was too much." Xiu raised his hand to hold it in his arms, and then took the fruit. "Come, eat something, I have an idea." Piku looked at Xiu strangely. Why is this person so strange? Can he laugh after being electrocuted? And he said some strange words. Piku's weakness is visible to the naked eye, and the electric current did not cause any harm to Xiu, but reminded him of some interesting things. For example, the impact of electric current on the body. Perhaps it can stimulate the growth of the body and stimulate potential through electric current. But thinking about it, Xiu felt that it was not very reliable. After all, this current is difficult to control, and the impact is still unclear. Piku ate the fruit while Xiu was talking nonsense, and then lay in Xiu's arms. Xiu held Piku and sat on the bench. At this time, the sunset spread on him, and some gifts from the sun were slowly fading. He gently rubbed its furry belly like petting a cat. I really hope this leisurely time will last forever. Pigzu Piku. In his dream, Xiu always felt that he heard Piku's cry, and there were some strange sounds. Originally, Xiu was full of vigilance when sleeping in such a place, not to mention when he heard such strange noises. This woke him up directly from his light sleep. Before he could react more, he really heard Piku's cry from the outside, and it was still pulling at his tent. Xiu subconsciously wanted to pull the zipper open, but before he could pull it completely open, two big ears came in, and then Xiu seemed to hear a pop sound, and Piku's whole head came in. Piku! Piku! Piku's two little hands seemed to want to push in, twisting their necks. What are you doing? Xiu thought it wanted to come in, and stretched out his hand to pull the zipper open, but he was afraid of pinching it, so he held it down. Don't move yet. Piku was held down by Xiu, and stopped immediately, motionless. Xiu hurriedly unzipped the tent, and it fell in completely, but it rolled over and stood up, dragging Xiu's trouser leg with one hand and pointing outside with the other. Piku! What? Xiu hurried out of the tent. As soon as he got outside, he felt what Piku wanted to tell him. It was going to rain heavily. Xiu watched the black clouds in the sky swallow up the last bit of light brought by the night view of the city, and the gradually increasing strong wind made Xiu's clothes rustle. Xiu didn't hesitate too much and turned around to pack up the tent. Such a small tent was completely useless in the face of heavy rain. Hiding in it was just a prison. Xiu was packing up, and Piku was circling around him, stopping from time to time, looking up at the black clouds in the sky, and then running again. It can be seen that a trace of electricity jumped on its cheek from time to time. Fortunately, although it was troublesome to assemble the tent, it was very convenient to disassemble it. It was easy to put it back. Xiu didn't spend much time to put the things back into the backpack, and then shouted to Piku, Piku, come here. Piku stopped suddenly and looked at Xiu's hand stretched out to it. Come here quickly, the rainstorm is coming soon, you can't stay here, follow me. Xiu waved to it. Piku hesitated for a moment before rushing towards Xiu, leaping onto Xiu's hand and quickly climbing onto Xiu's shoulder. Let's go. Xiu knew that he had to hurry up and find a place to shelter from the rain. Piku pointed in a direction. Xiu was not very familiar with the area, so he could only follow Piku's instructions. It should be late at night, most of the buildings had turned off the lights, and only the street lights were still standing on both sides of the street. Xiu ran on the street with the help of the dim street lights. The whistling wind around him seemed to be urging him, and tiny drops of water had begun to float in the sky. In fact, the distance was not far. Xiu followed Piku's instructions and saw a 24-hour convenience store with a sign on it from a distance, a few dozen meters away from the street. The oppressive feeling brought by the outside environment became stronger and stronger, and Xiu seemed to feel that breathing put pressure on his body. Xiu didn't care so much and pushed the door in. Welcome. A mechanical voice sounded, and the figure at the front desk suddenly raised his head and looked over here. Just as he thought it was okay, the next second the man cried out unconsciously, but the next second the sound was suppressed again. Ah! The other party's strong reaction also caught Xiu off guard. He could only subconsciously raise his hand and wave, and then explained, I just came in to avoid the rain. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 34. At this time, Piku, who had been squatting on Xiu's shoulders, jumped up from him and jumped directly to the front desk. The store clerk's nervous expression relaxed slightly after seeing Piku, but her eyes still drifted towards Xiu. Xiu felt a little uncomfortable when she looked at him, so he instinctively took a step back, and inadvertently saw his current appearance through the reflection of the glass door. To be honest, the current state of repair is very poor, the appearance is slovenly, and I look like a non-mainstream person with beggar attire. It was fine at first, but the clothes were a bit old, and the whole person was still clean. But I was woken up just now, and I didn't have time to take care of my clothes. Then, I was blown by the strong wind, and my hair was all messed up. Immediately it becomes shamate. It's no wonder the store clerk had such a reaction. I'm sorry. Xiu tidied up his appearance a little and showed his true face. Only then did he feel the other party's eyes slightly leave, and at the same time heard her whisper. Why are you here? Is it going to rain again? Piku Piku. Xiu watched the two of them talking and had no intention of interrupting. He found a corner near the door that would not affect others and sat down. He leaned against the glass wall of the convenience store and watched the outside gradually change. Heavy rain. As soon as I relax and contemplate my thoughts, I can't help but drift away with the raindrops. What happened on the last rainy night is still vivid in my mind, as if it was just yesterday. That night completely changed his peaceful life, and he didn't know what would happen now if he had hid honestly at the beginning. Piku. A cry pulled Xiu back, and when he looked down, Piku jumped onto his lap, shouting. Piku. Before Xiu could guess what it meant, another sound distracted him. Hello, who are you? The clerk came over with a glass of steaming water. Seeing the other party coming, Xiu quickly stood up and said, Hello, I will leave when the rain stops. I won't trouble you. If there is any inconvenience, I will leave now. Xiu looked at the other party carefully. The girl has delicate features and a thin body. She has long, slightly withered hair hanging on her body. She is wearing very ordinary clothes and an orange vest with a convenience store logo on it. My name is Xiao Yuan. The clerk didn't expect Xiu to be so easy to talk to. She was stunned for a moment. While introducing herself, she pushed out the water glass in her hand and said, please drink some water. Thank you. Xiu took the water glass and nodded towards her. This is a tissue. Xiao Yuan said and pointed to Xiu's hair. Thanks. Xiu took the tissue as if he was flattered, but stopped talking about the topic. The atmosphere was a bit awkward for a while, so Xiu had to find another topic. I thought I heard you talking to Piku just now. Do you know each other? Piku heard Xiu mentioning him and immediately called out to indicate that he was there. Xiu smiled and touched Piku's head. Seeing the interaction between the two of them, Xiao Yuan smiled and took over the conversation. I know, this little guy lives in the small park at the end of the street. I don't know whether it was because the night shift was really boring or for some other reason, but Obara followed this topic and talked about Piku. And Xiu also re-understood Piku from her perspective. This Piku has been in this area for a while. At first, it had a small bell on its body. She was not sure about the situation during the day, but at night she could hear the sound wandering around the nearby streets, and sometimes a trash can appears in front of the convenience store. The contact between the two was limited to a quick glance through the glass door and the erratic sound of the bell. But she didn't pay much attention to these, until one day it rained suddenly, and the sound of the bell disappeared. In the past, she didn't think anything was wrong with it, and she even felt a little annoyed. But at that moment, she didn't know why, but a trace of worry arose in her heart. Xiao Yuan looked at the violent storm outside. She was a little worried about where Piku had gone. It's just that after 2 days of not hearing the ringing of the bell, the feeling fades away. It's like a friend who has met a few times but is not familiar with leaves. It is inevitable to feel a little sad. At the same time, busy life and time will dilute everything. And just when I was passing by a small park after get off work, I discovered Piku dying in the corner by the sound of the bell. At that time, she didn't understand the situation of the elf, so she just tried her best to give him some water and bread. For 3 consecutive mornings, she would have breakfast in the small park when she got off work, and bring some water and food to Piku. Fortunately, Piku carried it over and was not killed by the pain, but survived strongly. After that, the two gradually became familiar with each other until today. The heavy rain you are talking about, could it be? Xiu couldn't help but ask after hearing this, and after asking for confirmation, he was even more surprised. Unexpectedly, it was really the heavy rain that happened when the park suddenly changed. It seems that it changed more than just my life trajectory. So if it rains now, it will come here to take shelter. I just don't know why it seems to have lost its bell. Is this what you're talking about? As he spoke, Xiu took out a small copper bell and the red rope tied to it. That's it. Xiao Yuan was a little curious when he saw the bell, and asked, so are you its trainer? No, Xiu shook his head, then looked at the Piku beside him and slowly told him about his encounter with it. What's the matter with it? Shouldn't all Pokemon have trainers? From this sentence, Xiu could tell that Xiao Yuan had not been exposed to this aspect. He probably got all the information about Pokemon and trainers from TV or hearsay. That's not the case. The relationship between Pokemon and trainers is not understood in this way. Then Xiu analyzed the situation based on his knowledge and said with emotion, it should have been abandoned by the original trainer. Abandoned? Xiao Yuan's mood seemed a little strange after hearing this word. I'm not sure either. It's better to ask it itself. Xiu had to focus his attention on the somewhat confused Piku beside him. The long conversation between the two humans obviously exceeded its ability to understand, and it seemed dull. It was not until Xiu looked at him that it became a little more confused and tilted its head to look at Xiu. Piku? Ask it? But how? It can't talk. Obviously, Xiu's words were beyond Xiaowen's understanding again. Her reaction at this moment was not much better than Piku's. Xiu smiled slightly, took out the pokeball with his backhand, and boasted confidently. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 35. Trainers naturally have the ability to communicate with Pokemon, otherwise how can they be trainers? While he was talking, Casey appeared in the convenience store. Xiu's words and the scene appeared in front of Xiao Yuan, making her curious. A world she had never touched before was opening up to her. Come on, Casey, help me connect telepathically with Piku. Xiao Yuan looked at Xiu, who was still talking just now, but fell silent the next second, and a bad expression flashed across his face from time to time. And Piku kept saying something on the side, but to her it sounded like Piku Piku. Although Xiao Yuan didn't understand what the two of them were doing, she knew it was not the time for her to speak, so she just watched curiously on the side. After a while, Xiu made an expression of sudden enlightenment. He finally knew where the bell came from, and he didn't expect Piku to be so miserable. As if sensing the gaze from Xiao Yuan, Xiu looked up, sorted out his thoughts a little and said, it originally lived in. Piku originally lived in the forest near the Light Red City, where there were many Piku and its evolved form Pikachu. Life was not very good, but it could be said to be good. At least there was no worry about food and drink, and there were many friends. Until one day a group of people broke into the forest and used traps and some tools to capture Piku, and the playful Piku was very unlucky to become one of them. He was locked in a cage with many companions. After a period of bumpy ride, he was sent to a breeding house, where he waited to be bought. Because Piku looks cute, there are many audiences, especially some children. Moreover, if Piku is not a main battle Pokemon, but a pet, then its appetite is very small, and even ordinary families can afford it. So Piku was spotted by a child and brought back home. Pokemon like Piku are not aggressive. They adapt to the environment of that family with just a little familiarity, and are even quite popular because of their cute appearance. But the problem is that the breeding house did not tell ordinary people about the disadvantages of Piku, which led to Piku being driven out and wandering outside because he could not control the discharge and accidentally shocked the little boy several times. So Piku felt very guilty after shocking Shiu, and the bell was a gift from the breeding house when selling Piku. It was worn around Piku's neck when he was at the little boy's house. In fact, it is a pet symbol. When Shiu told Xiao Yuan about Piku, she was very angry. How can those people do this and abandon Piku casually? It's all market problems. They don't know that Piku has this defect. Shiu is more rational than Xiao Yuan. This pot should not be taken by that family. The breeding house also has a large part of the responsibility. People who can run a breeding house must know this defect of Piku, even if he is a pet. But telling the defect will inevitably affect the sales of Piku. For the sake of profit, the people in the breeding house will definitely not tell it, so the situation of Piku is difficult to eliminate. Shiu is sure that there are many elves abandoned like Piku in the city. But, he was powerless. In fact, Xiao Yuan also knew that he could not change anything. Apart from the accusation at the beginning, the rest was only silence. Piku. The little Piku jumped down from Shiu's side, then came between the two of them, stood up and called out, as if telling them not to worry, showing quite optimistic, and seemed to have walked out of the shadow of that incident. However, the way Shiu looked at Piku aroused his doubts. Because as far as he knew, Piku's IQ was not high, in fact, it was about the same level as Rathuta, at most a little higher. But the Piku in front of him showed an IQ far beyond that. This was obviously not very reasonable, or did he understand it wrong before? Shiu suddenly reacted from a burst of laughter, looked to the side, and saw that Piku was making some strange movements and expressions to make Xiao Yuan laugh. Seeing this, he just smiled and shook his head. It was useless for him to pursue these things now. The rainstorm came quickly and fell all night. It was not until after 4 o'clock in the morning that it weakened, and it was not until 5 o'clock that it really stopped. Shiu closed the book in his hand, looked up at Xiao Yuan who was sleeping on the counter and Piku curled up beside her. Then he turned around and looked at the hazy halo in the sky. A new day has come. Welcome. A mechanical voice came, and Xiao Yuan, who was originally lying on the counter, sat up as if reflexively, and looked towards the door with hazy eyes, just in time to see Shiu open the door. Shiu heard the movement behind him, looked behind him, and said apologetically, "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you up." "What time is it now?" Xiao Yuan looked at the wall clock in a daze, and when she saw that it was already past 5 o'clock, she seemed to wake up. "It's okay, fortunately you woke me up, otherwise I would definitely be scolded." Seeing her reaction, Shiu's smile on his face suddenly withdrew, and he asked back, "What's the situation?" Xiao Yuan shook her head helplessly after hearing this, "Nothing." Then he started to pack up, without any intention of continuing. Pikachu was also awakened by the noise and instinctively wanted to hide, but it reacted only when it saw Xiao Yuan. It sat aside obediently with a human-like sleepiness on its face. Seeing her performance, Shiu's expression became more solemn and he asked, "If you have any trouble, can you tell me? Or I can help you solve it." "It's nothing, just some things at home." Xiao Yuan stopped what he was doing, looked up at him, and forced a smile on his face. Seeing this, Shiu did not continue to ask further questions and nodded towards him. "Then I'll go first. Goodbye." When Shiu left, Obara's face that had been forcibly propped up immediately collapsed and he speeded up his hands. Piku on the side yelled softly at this time. "Paichu." Xiao Yuan was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "I'm fine, don't worry." As he spoke, he took out 2 coins from his body and threw them into the counter. Then he took a piece of bread from the side of the counter and tore it in half. Half of it was put into Piku's hand, and the other half was bitten in his mouth. He mumbled something while walking towards the door. Piku shouted, then ran out with a piece of bread about the same size as himself. After Piku came out, Obaro locked the door and left the convenience store. But neither she nor Piku noticed a person coming out of the corner and walking slowly along their path. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 36. It was already mostly daylight at this time, and some office workers began to appear on the street in a hurry. I just don't know why, but Xiao Yuan's spine seemed to bend a bit after seeing the sun, and his thin body looked particularly weak walking on the empty street. Xiao Yuan stopped at the entrance of the small park, leaned over and looked at Piku beside him, and smiled at it. Go back quickly, I have to leave too. You damn girl, why did you come back so late? Do you want to starve your brother to death? There was a gorgeously dressed woman sitting in the living room, but no matter how she decorated herself with external objects, her aging face could not be concealed. As soon as O'Hara entered the door, she heard a sharp sound coming from the room, but she had a normal look on her face, but her spine was a little lower than before. Without a word of explanation, Xiao Yuan just walked in with his head lowered and greeted the middle-aged woman sitting in the living room. Good morning, Aunt. After saying that, he silently tried to pass through the living room and enter the kitchen. What kind of attitude do you have? I'm asking you a question. The woman felt that she was being slighted, stood up with a bang, pointed at Xiao Yuan and cursed. It rained heavily last night, so many shops were not open, so I had to wait for a while at the market. You're such a damn girl, you always make excuses. Don't you know your brother wants to go to school? How can you afford it if it's delayed? It was okay if he didn't explain. Once he did, the woman became even more irritable and cursed. Everything you eat and wear doesn't belong to my family. If our family hadn't received you in the first place, you wouldn't even know where you were dead now. Why are you making noise so early in the morning? A slightly irritable voice came, and the door to the room behind the living room opened, and a boy who looked to be about 11 or 12 years old walked out of it with a bit of anger. This child has a fat head and big ears, and the facial features on his face are sunken and squeezed by the fat. His green bean eyes look like those of a tortoise, which gives people a very unconventional but very appropriate feeling. It's okay my good son, I will teach this dead girl a lesson. It's still early, why don't you go get some sleep and I'll wake you up for breakfast later. The woman's attitude towards the boy was completely different. Her voice suddenly softened several levels, as if she was worried about scaring him. You stay at my house every day. The boy glanced at Xiao Yuan and turned back to his room, the disgust in his eyes undisguised. Xiao Yuan just stood silently. You haven't made breakfast yet. Why are you standing here? When the woman saw Xiao Yuan like this, she immediately roared again. Xiao Yuan had no choice but to carry his things and walk into the kitchen without saying another word. The woman then sat back on the sofa. She had a look of gnashing her teeth just now, but now it completely disappeared, and her attention was focused on the TV. I don't know where that resentment came from, and I don't know where it went from. It was as if the scene just now had never happened, and there was only a slight sound in the kitchen. A family of 3 was sitting happily at the dining table, enjoying a sumptuous breakfast. In addition to the fat man and the woman, there is also a middle-aged man in a suit and leather shoes. You can tell from his facial features that he must have been good-looking when he was young. He also has a faint smile on his face, which makes him look very friendly. O'Hara, have you eaten? Come over for breakfast. The man waved to the side, but when Xiao Yuan heard this, his hand holding the broom tightened, and his finger bones began to turn white. He quickly turned his head and replied, "I have already eaten." After saying that, he moved his body away from there. "What do you care about her?" The woman glanced at the man after hearing this. Her dissatisfaction was obvious. She turned to Xiao Yuan and gritted her teeth and said, "Don't sleep like a dead person all day long. Remember to give away your clothes after sweeping, after washing. Remember to be careful with my pajamas, otherwise you will be dead." "Yes," Xiao Yuan responded in a low voice, silently doing the housework at hand. "I've finished eating." The little fat man wiped his greasy lips and leaned on the chair like a fat pig, his green bean eyes darting around. When the woman heard this, she immediately changed her expression and said in a broad voice, "Are you full? Do you want to eat more? Don't be hungry again when you get to school." When the little fat man heard this, he immediately reached out to the woman and asked unceremoniously, "Give me money, I'll buy it when I'm hungry." "Okay." By the time that family left one after another, she was still burdened with complicated housework. By the time they were all completed, it was already past 9 o'clock. After completing the task, Xiao Yuan staggered into the house and opened one of the doors. In the dim light, everything that came into view was piled up with debris, but she didn't even turn on the light, so she walked in skillfully. At this time, she had no feeling at all, and she was just lying on the simple floor in the corner, looking haggard and numb. Slowly, she reached into the debris beside her, took out a thick photo album and opened it. All that could be seen in the dim light was a vague human form, but Obara's numb expression suddenly broke away. He couldn't help biting his lower lip and whispered to himself with a slight trembling, "Mother." The voice calmed down for a moment, but Xiao Yuan had already curled up with the album in his arms, and seemed to have fallen asleep, but his uncontrollable tears wet the pillow. "Welcome." There was a mechanical sound, and Xiao Yuan looked up and looked outside, only to see a person walking straight in. When she got a little closer, she recognized that the person who came was actually Xiu. "Xiu." Xiao Yuan was stunned for a moment, and subconsciously said, "Pikachu is not here." No. Xiu shook his head slowly, approached, leaned on the counter to look at him, and said, "I came to see you." "Me?" Xiao Yuan didn't understand what Xiu meant, but his aggressive action made her subconsciously take a few steps back. That's right. Xiu also realized something, restrained his action slightly, and stepped back. "Are you interested in working with me?" "What are you talking about?" Xiaowen's face was full of doubts. Xiu's current attitude was very different from the humble and gentle one before. This abnormality made her unconsciously alert. "I have a project that needs a partner. Are you interested?" Xiu didn't continue to talk nonsense and directly laid out his purpose. Xiao Yuan smiled bitterly and shook his head, and said reluctantly, "I have no money and I don't know anything." "Of course I know this. I will take care of the money and other things. You just need to follow my instructions. As for the rest, I will teach you. No, I still have work to take care of. Is there anything you need?" "The better," Xiu said, the more afraid Xiao Yuan became. His eyes kept looking outside, begging for someone to come in. "No, I want you." Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 37. Stop joking. Xiao Yuan's face was stiff, with an embarrassed expression on his face. When Xiu heard this, he seemed to have confirmed what Xiao Yuan meant. He actually didn't say it again. Instead, he stopped and looked directly at her. After a moment, he shook his head and whispered, "I thought you would want to leave such a family environment. I didn't expect that. I saw it wrong." After that, he turned around and left without any intention of staying. It's just that Xiu's words were no less than a thunderbolt in Xiao Yuan's ears, striking straight into her heart. Seeing Xiu's retreating figure, Xiao Yuan couldn't help but stretched out his right hand and shouted, "Hey! What are you talking about? But Xiu didn't pay attention at all, and opened the door directly, and the mechanical bell repeated the sentence welcome. Xiao Yuan didn't know why, but he impulsively ran out of the counter and stopped Xiu at the door with his hand. Wait. Who are you? Why? Xiu looked at the thin figure in front of him, and all his original words were stuck in his throat. He paused for a moment before letting out a low sigh. Since you don't accept my invitation, there's no need for me to waste my time here. However, I can go and help you intimidate you. Just treat it as a return of the favor. Why do you want to know this? Xiao Yuan asked him strangely. Unexpectedly, Xiu curled his lips when he heard this, and said in a slightly complaining tone, No, I don't want to know, I just don't want to owe a favor. Xiao Yuan looked at this strange person in front of him, and the worries in his heart just now miraculously disappeared, and for some reason a strange feeling arose. Let's talk after we come in. Xiao Yuan opened the door, then looked back at Xiu. He just hesitated for a moment and walked in again, but this time Xiao Yuan did not rush back to the counter. Instead, he leaned against the wall and talked to himself. Once upon a time there was a little girl. Xiu Zi acted as a listener and stood quietly opposite her. Just listening to Obara's story, Xiu couldn't help being infected by the emotions in it, and he felt a little disgusted. How should I put it? Xiao Yuan lived in a well-off family before she was 11 years old. Although her parents were busy with work, they also cared for her. The family was stable and she had no worries about food and clothing. She could live and work in peace and contentment, and be happy. Until an accident suddenly happened and took away the lives of her parents without mercy, the original family was instantly shattered. And she also faced a problem. The person in charge of the case once hinted to her that the accident involved some special circumstances, and it was best for her to get over it with a huge compensation. But she chose not to pay compensation and wanted to know the details of the incident. I don't know why, but for a while, she became a person that others avoided. Not to mention other things, even her parents' funerals were organized with the help of several close friends of her parents. However, those relatives who had been close to each other suddenly all disappeared. But this matter was not over yet. Suddenly one day, the door of her house was knocked open, and her younger brother, who had a normal relationship with her father, came in with his family. He took documents obtained from someone who didn't know where and became her acting responsible person, signed a compensation agreement on her behalf on the grounds that she was a minor, and occupied the inheritance that originally belonged to her. It has been more than 2 years since that day. Then what's going on here? Xiu glanced at the convenience store. He arranged the night shift for 800 yuan a month. Xiu sneered, but instead of continuing the topic, he led it to the other side. So now you want to wait until you're an adult and take it all back? Obara didn't answer, but he basically acquiesced. But Xiu smiled contemptuously and asked, even I know this, why do you think they can't think of it? You don't even think about it, can't they provide you with better conditions? This way you can even be moved past that year. Isn't this better? But why are they doing this now? They beat and scold you every day and assign you heavy tasks. Have you ever thought about why? Xiao Yuan was stunned for a moment when he heard Xiu's words and couldn't even answer. Xiu knew it when he saw her reaction, and couldn't help but remind him. They are killing you, or taming you. Do you remember yourself 2 years ago? Looking at you now, do you think you can persist until adulthood? Or are you sure you will get back what belongs to you at that time? After hearing these words, Xiao Yuan felt like she was enlightened. Her mind went blank for a few seconds. When she reacted, she felt a slight feeling of dampness and heat on her back. But the next second she looked at Xiu and asked curiously, how do you know this? Who are you? I'm just a wandering ordinary person. As for how I know, you don't need to worry about it, I have no reason to harm you anyway. Then why do you want to help me? No, I just need a helper to complete one thing, and you are perfect for it. But if you join, you can at least escape from this current environment, and in return, I will help you take everything back when the time is right." After Xiu said these words, Xiao Yuan was silent for a moment, but it could still be seen from some details that she had been shaken, and at least she understood her current situation clearly. "I am an orphan, but I have never met my parents, and I don't even know what they look like. My time in the orphanage was similar to yours now, but there is a big difference between you and me, that is, I escaped from the orphanage. Even if I almost lost my life there, I will never regret it." Xiu threw out this sentence and directly broke through Xiaowen's defense. "Then what do I need to do?" Hearing this, Xiu looked up at the wall clock and said lightly, "You must make a conclusion with your current life before you can welcome a new life." Before Xiao Yuan understood the sentence, Xiu urged, "Let's go, close the door and go home, take some things you think are important first, and then calculate the rest slowly." Xiao Yuan didn't know why, Xiu's words seemed to have a strange bewitching power. Anyway, when she came to her senses, she was already standing in front of her house, and she was holding the key in her hand. "Come in," Xiu whispered, and walked in on tiptoe. Xiao Yuan followed him in as if possessed by a ghost. The two of them walked around the house carefully. When they came out, the only extra thing was the heavy photo album in front of them. The two ran outside. Xiao Yuan's face was flushed with a strange flush, her breathing was heavy, and her expression was in a very strange way, with excitement mixed with fear. On the contrary, Xiu didn't change at all when he went in and out, and he still looked the same, as if what he had just seen was not Xiao Yuan's home, but his home. "Let's go, I will give you a satisfactory answer." Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 38. It's so late, where are we going? Just follow me and you'll find out. By the way, I'll tell you what's going to happen next. Hugh explained his plan to her as he walked down the street. His idea is very simple, to make money by relying on information differences, and the specific method is piracy. The average price of a book involving elf knowledge is about 500, but the cost is only a dozen yuan. It is not an exaggeration to describe it as a huge profit. When he visited Qianhong Market before, he had paid attention to these bookstores and had some understanding of prices and consumption. Just don't know why. There are few or no pirated and second-hand books. What he has to do now is to fill this gap and educate some of those bookstores. As for the copyright issue, he is going to do piracy, who cares about you? Xiao Yuan walked through the streets with Xiu holding the photo album. Hearing Xiu's alternative plan and the huge profits, he became obsessed with it for a while. Until Xiu stopped in front of an old building. "This is..." Obaro looked around. "This is the old city. Although it was close to the city center before, it has been abandoned by the times. Most of the buildings are low and old. There are no employment opportunities, and few young people come here. This makes this place even more, the edges looked lifeless. This was originally a printing factory affiliated with a small publishing house, but unfortunately the publishing house closed down a few years ago. You should know the location of this place. No one has taken it over, so the things inside are all well preserved. Supporting small printing machine," Xiu said, unlocking the door and pushing in. The light flickered tenaciously for a few times before settling down, bringing light back into the room. "This is just a very ordinary hall, with only a few wooden tables stacked in the corner. Even though I had opened the ventilation this morning, there was still a strange smell permeating the surroundings for some reason. Come on, I'll take you in and take a look at the back. Everything is in the back." Xiu closed the door and walked straight in. Passing through the hall, there is a yard at the back. After the trees that were originally used for decoration have lost their care, their leaves have dried up and fallen off. Only branches like ghost claws are left, and some are sickly. They are probably about the same. This is the warehouse. There are a lot of raw materials in it. It's only a few years old. It's hard to say whether it can be used. The machine is on the other side. Xiu introduced him as he walked, and without any hesitation he opened the dusty door. Cough cough cough. Unprepared, Xiao Yuan was hit by the sudden dust, and had to subconsciously close her eyes and cover her mouth and nose. When she got used to it a little, she looked up and saw that rows of machines almost filled the entire warehouse. These together with the venue cost me a total of 100,000 yuan. We were lucky enough to find such a cheap place. You must know that the original price of these machines is 500,000 to 600,000 yuan, and the investment in the entire printing plant is around 1.2 million yuan. Now it is given to us as scrap metal. Xiu checked forward, then pulled out a cardboard box from under the workbench, opened it, picked up the items and looked through them. Of course, after it has been left for such a long time, if you want to restart it, you will definitely need maintenance. Fortunately, the relevant manuals are still there. I can solve this problem by just researching it. Do you know how to do this? Xiu just smiled slightly when he heard this. He was a serious mechanical engineer and later switched to network engineering. He has a considerable foundation in both machinery and the internet. Even if the mechanical structure of this world is different, the essence remains the same. It should not take him much time to pick it up again. It can be said that an engineer who does not understand network is not a good designer. Xiao Yuan came up curiously, but she could understand the words above individually, but she couldn't understand them together. And the lines on the drawing are even more dazzling to see. Don't worry about this, I'll take care of it. Xiu didn't say anything clearly, he just put the manual down and continued to lead her away. I probably introduced the machine and then moved to other rooms. Because it closed suddenly, some of the raw materials here are well stored, but... Xiu flipped through the items and knew that he would have to pay more. After walking around for a while, the two returned to the hall again. Xiu looked at Xiao Yuan and looked at each other for a moment before asking. I've introduced the situation to you, and you know what the environment is. Now I'll give you two choices. One is that I recruit you, pay you monthly salary, and you work for me. The second is to become a partner, you can get 5% of the income. After finishing speaking, Xiu paused for 2 seconds and then added another sentence. Of course, not only is food and accommodation included, but the salary is reasonable. It won't be 800 yuan. In the future, as long as you do well, your salary will be increased depending on the situation. I want to join. Xiao Yuan gave the answer after thinking briefly. I have to tell you, joining a team means taking risks, and the work is more arduous, most importantly. If something goes wrong, you won't get a penny, but your salary should be more stable. If you really can't make money, why would you invest hundreds of thousands? Xiao Yuan was more relaxed than before. He smiled and said, I believe you, anyway, I have nothing. Okay, Xiu is not an indecisive person. It's not too early. Now you go to bed. I will tell you the real plan in detail tomorrow. What Xiu said before is all superficial, and the real core has not been said yet. After all, the less people know about some things, the better. By the way, where are we sleeping? Xiao Yuan finally realized what he was doing. He seemed to have walked around and saw machines and various materials. Attic. Xiu pointed to the top and explained, this was originally a factory. There is no such thing as a dormitory. However, the attic used to be an office and was slightly renovated. As Xiu said that, he took her up there. There were probably some documents in that office before, but now they were all cleaned up, leaving only dilapidated tables and chairs and garbage on the floor. I'm a little pressed for time. I haven't cleaned it. It's so late now. Let's make do with it for now. Go get some water and wipe the sofa. Xiu took out the tent from his backpack and set it up directly in the office, while Xiao Principal used the tools Xiu had given him to scrub the already damaged sofa. Okay, he came out after repairing the mat, looked at Xiao Yuan who was cleaning at the side, and said casually, "Don't worry about that for now, you can sleep here, I will sleep on the sofa." After that, regardless of her reaction, he took the sleeping bag and lay down on the sofa. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 39. The long-standing biological clock came into play, and her hand holding the photo album tightened suddenly. Her whole body sat up like a spring, and then she looked around. It was a narrow space surrounded by grey cloth. After being in a daze for a while, she remembered what she had done last night. An emotion called fear suddenly burst out from the bottom of her heart, and the sultry feeling resurfaced again. What did I do? Xiao Yuan held his forehead with both hands, and an abnormal blush appeared on his entire neck, all the way to his ears. But that emotion disappeared, and the tense body just now slowly relaxed. Carefully pulling the zipper open, there was only a hazy outside world, but she saw the empty sofa at first glance. Her eyes widened for a moment, and she hurriedly crawled out of the tent. She just looked around, but she couldn't find Xiu anywhere. Slightly panicked, she quickly got up and walked outside. As soon as she opened the door, she saw the dim light downstairs, and now she felt relieved. What is he doing? Xiao Yuan walked downstairs slowly and looked inside curiously through the half-open door. I saw Xiu holding something in his hand, and the box next to him was the box from last night. Xiu seemed to notice the strange gaze, looked up, and met his eyes. What's up? Xiu's subconscious question woke Xiao Yuan up, and she had no choice but to push the door open and go in with some embarrassment, and responded with a smile, "No, what are you doing so early? Didn't I say that last night? Those machines need to be repaired before they can work." Xiu didn't care about her, and his eyes had returned to the book. But his mouth didn't stop. It's still early. You can sleep a little longer and go to work at 7 o'clock. However, Obara did not leave. Instead, he approached and asked, "What is my job?" "It hasn't officially started yet, so you can clean up here first." Xiu didn't even raise his head and said casually. After hearing this, Xiao Yuan walked out and came in with tools a moment later, cleaning silently. Xiu noticed the strange movement around him, glanced at it, and then returned to his own rhythm. "It's Casey. You've seen it before. It's a flying mantis. This guy is called Little Lucky Egg." Xiu took advantage of the breakfast time to introduce his elf to Xiao Yuan, and also told her the real focus of this project. This involves factors such as products, markets, target objects, etc. It is also a summary of the information that Xiu has investigated during this period. The growth of the elf has reached a stage bottleneck. If you want to break through this, in addition to maintaining training, you must use better resources. And whether it is to maintain the current cultivation or strengthen it, it will cost money. Xiu knew very well that no matter how much he saved, the 300,000 yuan would eventually be spent, and he had to find another source of income in order to maintain the cultivation of CAI-11 and others. In his previous life, he worked as a part-time worker until he died suddenly before helping his boss buy a new car. Now it is impossible to support them by working part-time. He can't even support himself. After all, he has nothing and is just a wandering orphan. It's impossible to work part-time, and it's impossible to work part-time in this life, so when you see a business opportunity, you just throw money into it. In order to get rid of the current constraints, he made a detailed investigation on this. As long as he does it properly, it won't take long to get a feel for the oil from those fat meats. I have some things to deal with later, so I'll leave this to you. If I don't come back, you can make some food yourself without waiting for me. Xiu left the stove and food behind, and after a few words of explanation, he hurriedly left the factory. Xiao Yuan watched Xiu leave, then looked back at the dusty and garbage-filled factory building. After taking a deep breath, he picked up the tools in his hands and walked inside. After Xiu left there, he came to the elf center and opened a single room. The cost really made him feel distressed for a while. It's just that so much money has been spent, so it's nothing more than an early investment. Computers are not yet popular in this world at this stage, and the high barriers to entry have resulted in the public's vague understanding of computers. Only some companies will have this demand. There is not even a place like an internet cafe outside. If he wants to access the internet alone, he must use the computer in the elf center. Although single rooms are expensive, they also have corresponding configurations. Pushing open the door and entering, Xiu ignored all the messy things and focused on the computer. He wanted to steal the database of a big bookstore, otherwise where would he have the resources to engage in piracy? It's almost 12 o'clock, it's time to rest. Obara walked into the printing workshop and shouted something inside. After a while, he heard a voice and saw Xiu standing out from the pile of machines. It's just that he looks a little embarrassed now, and he has obviously suffered a lot at the hands of these machines. Upon seeing this, Xiao Yuan hurriedly came up and asked with concern, "How is it?" "It's okay. The equipment is not damaged. I am sure that the maintenance will be completed within 3 days." Xiu was very confident in his ability. Instead, he asked Obara, "How are you doing there? We have already found quite a few people, but..." Xiao Yuan hesitated for a moment, but still asked, "But what do we need that information for?" She didn't understand why Xiu wanted to collect information about those families by himself. When she asked the question, Xiu was already squatting down and tinkering among the machines. However, this did not affect Xiu's words. When he heard Xiao Yuan's doubts, he chuckled and asked, "Who do you think our audience should be?" "Trainer," Obara tentatively gave an answer, and then added his own explanation, "Only those who have been in contact with elves for a long time will need these books, right?" This is indeed a fact. Only those who have regular contact with elves need these books, but that is just a common perception. Trainers are our target customers, but they are not our first target customers. Xiu's words sounded even more strange to Obara. It seemed that he confirmed his idea, but at the same time he seemed to deny it. Fortunately, Xiu didn't let her think about it by herself. Instead, he temporarily put down his work and explained to her in a serious tone. "I have seen the internal documents of those bookstores, and the user survey reports have already divided the categories for us. From it, we can see that the proportion of adult trainers is only 7%. Students accounted for 31%, and cultivators accounted for 24%. The remaining share is in researchers, teachers, and other professions related to elves." Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 40. Of course, I am talking about the entire big data. If it involves a single book, you still need to understand it in depth based on the content. For example, we are currently focusing on some basic reading materials such as Kanto Pokemon Illustrated Book. As he spoke, Xiu picked up the tools again and continued the work at hand, but he did not stop talking. Instead, he told Xiao Yuan some of the details. Trainers have high spending power, and a few hundred yuan is not a problem for them. They are likely to choose regular bookstores and are unwilling to take risks, so they are not our first target. On the contrary, in the information I gave you, all the families above have children who are about to go to school or are already going to school. Moreover, these schools are not ordinary ones, but elf-related schools. Their demand for these books is very obvious. The key is that the families I picked out are generally well off. Said Xiu, turned to Xiao Yuan and smiled. And she reacted and took over the words. Those from superior families won't care about the money. On the contrary, those from average families will be more likely to choose us. That's right, Xiu smiled and nodded, putting on a teachable expression. What he said was so clear that if Xiao Yuan couldn't understand it, he would be in trouble. Actually, there is another factor here. Xiu changed the topic and said slightly seriously, there is also a safety issue here. The reason for temporarily giving up on trainers with high spending power is to gain safety. After all, if those trainers target us, we will be in big trouble. And those families who are new to elves don't know much about this aspect, so even if they know that we are pirated, they won't react too strongly. Speaking of this, Xiao Yuan also felt a little worried, and couldn't help but ask, will those families because of our books, after all? Although O'Hara didn't tell the whole story, Xiu also noticed what she meant and couldn't help but chuckle. Ha! You are thinking too much. Although our books are not genuine, the content is the same as the genuine ones. Even if they know it, they will still protect us, unless they don't want such a cheap book. Xiu was afraid that she would think too much, so he added another sentence. You shouldn't think like this. You should think that if we didn't provide these cheap reference books, they would have to bear a heavy burden, and even have to interrupt their studies. We are here to share the burden for them so that their children can enjoy the same treatment as rich people. It seems so. It must be true. How could I lie to you? Get some rest early. Xiu finally put down the tools in his hands and walked out of the workshop with Xiao Yuan. Finally out. Xiu looked at the sample in his hand, but his mood was unusually calm. After so many days of preparation, it cost a huge amount of money and almost emptied his pocket. Getting this far means the hard part is solved and the rest are just hiccups. Obara came over, looked at the book titled Kanto Elf Illustrated Book, and asked curiously, is this kind of book really popular? This book costs more than 700 in a regular bookstore. We are selling it as a second-hand, defective product, and the price is only 300. Do you think it will be popular? It's so expensive. It only takes me a month. Even though he knew the profit was huge before, Xiao Yuan was still a little shocked when he heard the price, but Xiu leisurely read through the contents. You have also seen the cost. Our small workshop costs more than 10 yuan per copy. The cost control of those large factories is definitely better than ours, and at worst it is half less. But their income needs to be deducted from copyright fees, advertising fees, store rentals, and other messy things. We don't use these, which means we make a net profit from the difference. In this way, we can earn back the cost with only 200 copies. But this is not the point. The point is that this is one of a complete set of extracurricular books required by many schools. Think about it yourself. But Obara also noticed something wrong and asked carefully, but our paper is all yellowed, do they really not care about the quality? Who cares? They don't believe that this is a defective second-hand book. Xiu actually smiled, closed the book, and said with a hint of ridicule, we are popularizing elf knowledge, right? It's something that benefits everyone, not to mention you think those bookstores are clean. Xiu did not hesitate to tell some of the things he saw. Fraud, suppression, false information, bribery, monopoly, these things are endless. What do you think those bookstores are? Xiu's arrogant words echoed in Xiaowen's mind. It was the first time she accepted such information. She didn't expect that there was such a thing in it, and she couldn't help but feel a little distracted. But Xiu was very calm and knew that there was still one last step to complete. That's how to sell it. Let's get started. Print a batch of a few popular books first, and then buy the whole set for them with a discount. Xiu already had a plan in mind, arranged the work, and then returned to the yard to watch Casey and the others train. After hearing this, Obara didn't talk nonsense, and instead skillfully operated the machines. Wait and learn. Xiu was wearing a slightly loose formal suit, which forced his 13 or 14-year-old body into an adult. At least he looked much more mature. Xiao Yuan's was much simpler. He just carried a folder and a backpack and followed him like a follower. Xiu knocked on the door, and a housewife came out after a while, looking at the two strange people outside the door with some curiosity. "Hello, madam, we are employees of the Dato bookstore, and we would like to invite you to participate in a questionnaire." Xiu had a standard smile on his face, showing his friendliness. But after hearing this, the other party seemed not to care so much, and reached out to close the door. Of course, Xiu suddenly raised his voice and pulled the eaves of the door. "This questionnaire will only take you a few minutes, and there will be a small gift after completing it." Xiu's tone was suppressed at the end, and when he felt the force coming from his hand was reduced, he smiled and retracted it, then turned his head and glanced at Xiao Yuan beside him. Xiao Yuan also understood this, and quickly handed over a questionnaire. "Our Dato bookstore is targeting second-hand books recently." Xiu was saying something on the side, which sounded like an explanation, but for some reason Xiao Yuan always felt something was wrong. The woman obviously didn't listen to him, she simply filled out the questionnaire and handed it over. Seeing this, Xiu interrupted the topic just now and said thank you very much. Then he personally handed over a small gift. The woman didn't doubt him, staring at the thing in Xiu's hand, and only smiled and nodded at them after he got it. "By the way, I wonder if the lady has any books from our bookstore at home."